hour on the fire buys you 2.
Nora Callum was 19 years old on the morning she walked to the river. Her husband had been dead for 3 days. The blizzard was 4 days away. She had 10 days of firewood for a freeze that would last 19. No neighbour within 4 miles and no way to reach one. By any honest accounting, she was not going to survive the winter. She went to the river because she didn't know where else to go. What she found there, and what she did with it, is the reason she survived. To understand what she did, you have to understand first what she had already lost. The grave was behind the cabin, on the slight rise where creek-bottom clay gave way to harder ground. She dug it herself over 2 days because the earth below the first 6 inches had already begun to freeze, and she'd had to build a fire over the spot through an entire morning before a spade would go in cleanly. She might have sent word to Silas Pratt, the trapper who lived 4 miles north, who'd welcomed them to the territory in May with a single handshake and a plain warning about where the Musselshell flooded in spring. But she hadn't the heart to wait for anyone. Daniel had waited long enough. Nora Callum had been 24 years old. He'd spent his whole life working wood. On his father's place in Hocking County, Ohio, he and his brothers stacking cords before they were old enough to drive the team. He was not careless with it. He understood loads and balance. The load that shifted and came down across his left leg at the knee that first morning of November was simply heavier than he'd reckoned, and the reckoning was the only mistake he ever made that cost something past recovering. She'd found him in the snow beside the woodpile, logs fanned around him in the rough shape of his fall. He had dragged himself 6 feet toward the cabin before his arms gave out. 8 days. That was what blood poisoning took from a man who had everything else. 8 days of fever and lucid intervals, and stretches of terrible calm in which Daniel spoke clearly about what needed to be done. The land deed, the spring creek management, the solicitor in Roundup who could be trusted. He was organized about it in the way a man is organized when the only useful thing left is to make the path forward clear. On the 6th day, he held her face in both hands and looked at her without speaking. On the 8th night, his breathing shifted in a way she felt before she heard it. She held his hand until it stopped. She had not cried at the river. She was not entirely sure she had cried anywhere. There was too much to do. Grief, she was finding, occupied the same space in a body that useful thought occupied, and the two could not run together at full strength. One of them would have to wait. She looked down at the bank beneath her feet. The river bottom was covered in stones, dark, smooth, flat-bellied basalt, volcanic rock worn to roundness by the Musselshell over time she couldn't reckon, packed thick along the bed and banked up onto the shore where she stood. Hundreds of them. The kind her father had called river belly rock. The kind he'd used to face the hearths around on the old farmhouse in Ross County, Ohio, packed tight in mortar against the foundation, absorbing the day's fire and breathing heat back through the long, dark hours after the wood had gone to ash. They hold it longer than you'd think, he'd told her once, pressing his palm flat against a hearthstone in a January pre-dawn. Hour on the fire buys you 2 hours of warmth after, sometimes 3 if the stone's right. She had been 9 years old, standing in her nightgown in the dark, watching her father's hand on the warm rock. Nora crouched and pressed her bare right hand flat against a stone at the bank's margin. Even in contact with the frozen edge, it was simply cold. Not cracked, not brittle. Dense and whole, heavy with its own internal mass. She looked back at the cabin. Daniel had begun cutting and stacking firewood in late September, 6 weeks behind where they'd planned to be because the cabin walls had taken longer than the homesteading manual said they would. What stood under the lean-to beside the south wall was 10 days of wood, perhaps 11 if she managed the burns carefully. 60 miles south was Roundup, with a supply merchant and a woodyard. 4 miles north was Silas Pratt, whose stores she had no right to presume upon. She did not know how long a Montana Territory freeze could hold in a hard year. The land claim pamphlet had described frontier winters as vigorous and clarifying, which was the way pamphlets described things that would frighten people if stated plainly. She picked up a stone. Flat, dense, the size of a large man's fist. 3 pounds in both hands, maybe 4. She carried it to the cabin and set it on the iron stove plate, which still held the morning's banked heat. Then she went back to the river. She made 11 trips that first morning, 3 and 4 stones at a time, choosing flat ones that would lie together without too many gaps. She selected them with attention, rejecting the round ones that would roll, the thin ones that would cool too fast, looking for the flat-bellied, substantial ones that had the same density her father's hearthstones had. She stacked them beside the stove and left them to absorb the day's heat. That evening, she pressed her hand against the pile. Warm, not scalding, but warm in the steady, patient way that a cast-iron griddle holds its warmth an hour after the fire's been drawn back. She returned to the river the next morning, and the morning after that. The work was hard, in the way all frontier work was hard, cumulatively, without drama. Her back tightened along the right side of her spine on the second day, and she managed it the way she managed everything she couldn't afford. With attention, and then without attention, and then without noticing at all. She stopped counting at 270 because the number didn't tell her anything useful. By the end of the third day, the cabin floor was covered from the north wall to the stove's base, a mosaic of dark, smooth stone in the lamplight, leaving only a narrow path to the door and a space beside the bed. More than 400 stones in all. Her arms ached from wrist to shoulder. That third evening she placed 6 of the largest stones directly on the stoveplate and fed the fire higher than she'd allowed herself yet. A calculated expenditure earned by 3 days of careful burning. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched the stones absorb the heat, watched the air above them distort in that specific way hot rock distorts air. Dry, faintly shimmering, like looking through old window glass into summer. 2 hours. Then she wrapped doubled burlap around her hand and moved them from the plate to the floor, distributing them in a pattern she'd arrived at without being taught. Largest stones to the perimeter, the warmest ones centered where her body would rest. She pressed her bare palm flat against the floor. Warm, wall to wall. She stood and crossed to the window. The sky to the north had changed. Not the flat grey of ordinary overcast, but something lower and more purposeful. The colour of iron that's been in a fire and cooled, but hasn't finished its business. The wind had found the gaps between the cottonwood logs with a new kind of insistence. The window glass flexed against it, steadied, flexed again. Along the bottom of the door, a thin line of snow had sifted in and lay across the floorboard. She could feel the cold radiating off the pane without touching it. The same quality as the heat radiating from the stones at her feet, but inverted, hostile, coming inward. She had not seen a Montana winter. She had not been here long enough to know precisely what was coming, but she had grown up on land that talked to you through its sky, and the sky was talking now. She stepped back from the window. She filled the woodbox. She banked the fire with a heavy split log laid flat to burn slow. She lay down on the bed without undressing, pulled both blankets to her chin, and listened to the wind build. A sustained roar that found the roof poles and made them creak, that found the window glass and made it hum at its edges, until the wind was something larger than weather, something that had made a decision about this valley, and then she slept. The blizzard arrived before dawn on the 4th day, and it did not arrive gradually. Nora woke first to stillness, the held breath silence of a storm in the moment before it commits fully to itself. Then it committed. The full weight of it arrived all at once. Sustained wind from the northwest, pressing against the cabin's north wall. Snow driving against the cottonwood logs with a steady hiss that did not stop. The window showed nothing but white. She managed the stove with the precision of a woman doing arithmetic she couldn't afford to get wrong. Small burns twice a day, enough to melt snow for water and warm the cornmeal. A hotter burn in the afternoon to cycle the stones through their heating so they could carry the night when the fire went to coals. She had a wood supply she'd measured and remeasured, and the number was not generous. She did not know the storm's depth. She asked herself that question once, on the second day, and refused to ask it again because it had no answer she could use. By the fifth day, she understood the afternoon stone heating cycle was costing her more than she'd planned. Heating basalt to its full depth required a sustained hot fire held for 2 hours, not the modest burn she'd calculated when she'd first conceived the system. The stones were earning their keep through the nights, but the wood was going faster than the stones were saving it. She made a decision. From here forward, the stove burned only for cooking. The stones would absorb what residual heat remained after each cooking fire and hold it as long as they could. No dedicated stone burns, no fires after dark. The wood would last exactly as long as it lasted, and that was the arithmetic now. On the 6th morning, she pulled on her coat and the heavy wool overskirt she'd taken to wearing as an outer layer and lifted the latch on the lean-to door. The cow was on her side. She had died in the night, not with struggle, not with sound, simply stopped, the way very cold animals stop when the cold has been patient enough and long enough to outlast the warmth a body generates. She was frozen through. The milk pail stood beside her, empty and rimed with frost, upright as if placed there deliberately. Nora stood in the lean-to a long time. The cold through the siding gaps was extraordinary, the cold of a blizzard at its sustained depth, which makes itself comfortable in any gap it finds. She looked at the cow's dark eye, half open, the lashes rimed with frost crystals. She had not named her. Daniel had said it was bad practice to name livestock you intended to use, and she had agreed with him at the time. She wished now she had argued the point. She closed the door. She went back inside. The loss of the milk was not the crisis. She had enough dried goods to manage without it. But there were no longer any living things sharing walls with her. The cow's breathing through the timber had been a constant she hadn't known she was tracking, and now the cabin had a different quality to its silence, larger, less occupied. She made herself a cup of coffee, the last of the good tin, uncut, properly brewed, and drank it standing at the stove while it was still steaming. Fear consumed energy she could not replace, and small deliberate pleasures were their own form of rationing. She would grieve the cow and Daniel and Ohio and everything else in spring when there was surplus enough to spend on it. The coffee was real and hot, and hers, and she drank every drop. 4 miles north, on the morning of the 7th day of the blizzard, Silas Pratt was up before the light. He'd been thinking about the Callum girl since the 2nd day of the storm. He knew Callum was dead before any word reached him. A working homesteader produced a specific rhythm of chimney smoke, and the smoke from the Callum claim had been wrong in its volume and timing since the 2nd week of November. Thin morning smoke meant a fire gone cold in the night and being rebuilt from scratch. Either the man was sick or he wasn't there anymore. The girl was alone up there, 19 years old and 4 miles from the nearest human being, which was him. He packed the panniers on the packhorse before first light. Smoked elk, coal oil, a good tin of coffee, and a bundle of split pine he'd dried specifically for hard weather emergencies. He loaded the Springfield trapdoor rifle he'd carried since '73 and pulled on his wolf hide mittens and the beaver felt hat he'd bought from a Crow trader on the Yellowstone in 71 and had never replaced because nothing worked better. He led both horses out of the barn and turned south into the blizzard. He made half a mile. The creek ford was one he'd crossed 100 times. Gravel-bottomed, knee-deep in summer, passable most winters if you read the surface. But the blizzard had pushed snow across the ice in a way that masked where solid footing ended and where moving water ran just beneath, and the pack horse went through before Silas could pull it right. Not deep, 3 feet of water over gravel, but the horse went in to the shoulder on the right side, and the cold hit the animal the way moving winter water hits horses, which is immediately and absolutely. The horse planted all 4 feet and would not go forward. Silas knew the signs. Another 5 minutes in that water and the horse would go down. He turned it.
He got it out.
He walked both animals back through the blizzard to the barn and spent an hour rubbing the pack horse down with dried grass until the shaking stopped. Inside his cabin, he sat at his table and looked at the wall. He was 45 years old. He had lost a partner named Graves through river ice on the Powder River in the winter of '64. Pulled him out, built a fire, done everything right, and Graves dead by nightfall because there was a temperature at which being in moving water was not recoverable, no matter what came after. He had thought about that day many times since, not with guilt, but with the helplessness of a man who had done everything correctly and still arrived at the wrong answer. He was being stopped from reaching a 19-year-old girl in a one-room cabin by 3 feet of water he couldn't predict the surface of. He sat at the table a long time. Then he got up and put wood on his own fire, because there was nothing else to do, and waited for the storm to give him an opening it didn't appear inclined to give. Back on the Musselshell, Nora had stopped sleeping in the bed. The warmth the stones released through the night gathered at floor level, where the air was still and dense. She'd figured this out on the 8th night, when she woke cold in the bed, reached down and found the floor still warm. She pulled the blankets down, made a pallet among the stones, and lay flat against them, spine against heated rock. She slept better than she had since Daniel died. On the 9th night, the temperature fell past the last graduation on Daniel's mercury thermometer. She'd checked it at dusk. A glass tube instrument in a wooden housing hung on the exterior north-facing log, graded in Fahrenheit. 32 below at dusk. At midnight, the column had dropped past the lowest marked grade. She put the lantern down and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the darkness that was the storm, and then she turned and went to work. She put the 6 largest stones on the stoveplate and fed the fire everything the wood box had left. Not recklessly, but fully, because there was no longer any point in managing what was finished. She cycled the stones for 2 hours, putting every degree she could extract from the last wood into the rock. She was methodical, not desperate, methodical. She had become, over 19 days in this cabin, something she didn't have a name for. Not brave, something more stripped down than brave, something that had decided to continue and was continuing, and that was sufficient. When the wood was ash, she moved the damper to its sealed position, trapping what heat remained in the iron. She spread both blankets across the floor's warmest section. She lay down and pulled the wool over herself until she was fully enclosed, spine flat against heated stone, the warmest rocks along the length of her body. The last glow in the stove's grate died. The cold was everywhere. Not the manageable cold she had built a system against. That cold she knew now, had a working relationship with. This was the cold underneath that cold. It pressed through the log walls, through the chinking, through the floorboards beneath the stones, through every gap in the sod roof. Patient and thorough, and it had all night to work with. She pressed herself flat against the stones. They were warm. Not hot. That hour had passed before she'd lain down. But warm, in the specific stubborn way that dense volcanic rock holds what it's been given, which is quieter and more patient than any other heat she had known. Not the warmth that announces itself, the warmth that simply refuses to leave. She held still and kept her breathing slow. She thought about May. Not November. She would not go to those 8 days tonight, not in the dark with the cold pressing in at every edge. She went to May instead. The morning she and Daniel drove the wagon down off the ridge into the Musselshell Valley for the first time, the board seat under them, the valley spread below in the green that belongs only to a Montana creek bottom in spring. Daniel had said something she hadn't fully understood at the time. It looks like it could hold us. She'd thought he meant the soil, the agricultural prospects. Now, lying flat in the dark, she thought he'd meant something less practical and more true. Something about what it felt like to arrive somewhere that had room for you. The cold pressed in around the blanket edges. She pulled them tighter. The stones held. Dawn came as grey light through the ice-filmed window glass. She lay still for a moment, not weak, not faint, counting. Her feet were cold, but not numb. Her hands were stiff at the knuckles, but opened when she told them to. The air was cold enough to see her breath. The pail by the door had skimmed ice across its surface. She was alive. She got up. The wood box was empty. The stove was cold iron. She dressed in every layer she owned, one over another, until she was shapeless with wool and canvas and coat, and then she took the hatchet from behind the door. The bed frame went first. The cottonwood slats and rough sawn pine crosspieces Daniel had built the first week after they'd arrived, using lumber hauled in from 60 miles south because he'd wanted her to have a proper bed and not a pallet on a dirt floor. She worked through the joins methodically, splitting each piece to stove length, and it burned through the 10th day and into the 11th. Then she took apart the shelf he'd built along the east wall. Good pine, well dried, giving her one more day. She found, without the pressure of acute crisis, that her mind worked more clearly on the stove's mechanics. By repositioning the stovepipe elbow on a shim she cut from a shelf board, she improved the draw enough to burn hotter on less wood. She understood the stove now the way she hadn't had time to understand it before. Its tolerances and efficiencies, the sound it made when working well. She hauled more stones from the river on the days the storm slackened enough to move through it for an hour, expanding the floor pattern toward the door she'd left bare in the beginning. She got better at the system. She could feel herself getting better at it, which was a strange and solid thing to feel in a Montana Territory winter with nothing left to burn but furniture. On the 13th day, she burned the 2 ladder-back chairs they'd brought from Ohio, which had never fit quite right in the cabin anyway. On the 15th day, she burned the packing crates. Heavy pine, the boxes built to cross a continent by rail and wagon and survive it. And they burned accordingly, hot and sustained, giving her 5 more days. She thought, without bitterness, that she was getting more heat out of Ohio than Ohio had ever managed to send on its own. The storm did not relent, but it did not worsen past the 9th night, and the stones cycled faithfully. Heat absorbed through the day, released through the dark, the floor warm each morning when she woke flat against it. She was very thin. She had rationed well, but not generously, and her body knew it. She noted this the way she noted the temperature, as information, not complaint. On the 19th morning, Silas Pratt woke before light to a silence he had been waiting 12 days to hear. The wind had stopped, not a lull, the actual cessation, the finished silence of something done. He got up and opened his door, and the cold hit him full in the face, and he took it without flinching, because the country had been calibrating him to cold for 22 years, and it had done the job. The sky above the creek bottom was clear, stars hard and bright. To the south, the first grey of dawn was showing above the ridgeline. He had the horses saddled before full light. He rode south through snow that came to the horses' knees in the drifts and to their hocks on the open ground, both animals willing in the cold, still morning after long confinement. He took the creek well east of the usual ford, where the channel was narrower and the ice showed solid white rather than the grey that meant water running close beneath. He rode across without incident and did not allow himself to feel the relief until he was fully on the other bank. The Callum claim came into view half a mile south. He saw the chimney smoke first, thin, steady, controlled. Not the smoke of desperation, the smoke of someone who had learned their stove. He let out a long breath through his nose and watched the vapour of it hang in the cold, still air. What he didn't know was that she'd burned the last piece of packing crate at first light that morning. When the storm broke, she'd been able to force the lean-to door fully open for the first time in 19 days. She went in past the cow's frozen shape and found 3 pieces of Daniel's cut wood still standing in the sheltered corner under the eave where the snow hadn't reached. She carried them inside, one at a time. That was the fire he saw in the chimney. Nora heard the horses before she reached the window. 2 sets of hoofbeats in packed snow, muffled and close, coming from the north. She watched Silas Pratt ride into the yard on his bay gelding, the pack horse on the lead behind him. He stopped in front of the cabin and looked at the chimney smoke, and something in his posture released. A tension he'd been holding too long, going out of him all at once, visible even at that distance, through all those layers of coat and hide. She had the door open before he reached it. He looked at her face, at her eyes, at the specific way she was standing. Whatever he needed to read in those things, he read it quickly. "Figured I'd come check," he said. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside, and he stopped. He stood in the doorway and looked at the floor. He did not speak for a long time. Dark, smooth river stones covered the boards from wall to wall. 400 of them, each one chosen and carried and heated and placed. The whole mosaic of them in the grey morning light. Still warm from the previous night's cycle, holding what they'd been given. He removed his wolf-hide mittens slowly. "I tried to come 12 days ago," he said, the words measured, as if he'd been carrying them ready for a while. "Pack horse went through the creek ice. Couldn't get across." "I know," she said. She said it because it was true in the way that mattered. She had known no help was coming, and she had acted accordingly. And the not coming was not his failure any more than her surviving was her accomplishment. Both were simply what had happened. Silas looked at the floor one more time, at the stones dark with river water long since dried, worn smooth by the Musselshell over centuries it hadn't spent waiting for anyone to need them. "Your father teach you that?" he said. "He showed me the hearthstones," she said. "I figured the rest." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard something that doesn't require more words than that, and knows better than to add any. She hung his coat on the peg by the door. She put water on the stove for coffee, the good coffee from the fresh tin on the pack horse, which she did not allow herself to cry about in his presence, because she had determined she would not, and the determination held. She set 2 tin cups on the table, the one piece of furniture that remained, and sat across from him and told him what had happened. In the order it had come. The wood supply calculated short and burning faster than planned. The cow lost on the 6th morning, frozen in the lean-to before the wood even ran out. The worst night on the 9th day. The bed frame after that. The chairs, the crates, the shelf boards. The 3 pieces of his cut wood she'd found under the eave this morning. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet a moment, looking at the floor. The stones lay in their pattern, dark and patient, worn smooth by the Musselshell over time neither of them could reckon, and still holding the faint warmth of this morning's fire. "You'll need lumber for the bed frame," he said, "and the chairs." "I will. I'll bring it in spring. There's a mill yard coming through that valley." "Thank you," she said. Outside, the Musselshell Valley lay white and absolute under the sky that had come after the storm. A blue so deep and complete it looked like something the storm had left behind on purpose. The colour of a sky that has nothing left to prove. The river moved dark between its frozen margins, going south as it had always gone south, carrying the cold and the season with it, asking nothing of the people on its banks except that they be present and willing to use what the land provided. Nora poured the coffee into both cups and pushed one across the table. She did not know yet what kind of woman she would be on this land when spring came, whether she would file for the remaining years of her homestead claim or let it go, whether she would stay on the Musselshell or go back east. She hadn't decided. She'd had no capacity to decide for 19 days, and she was not going to decide it this morning. But she was here to make that choice, and the stones on the floor were already warming again with the morning fire, and the coffee was hot. That was enough. For today, that was exactly enough. There are people in this country who survived things no plan could have prepared them for, not because they were extraordinary in the way stories sometimes demand, but because they were paying attention, and they used what the land put under their feet. If this story settles in you the way a hearthstone holds warmth past the fire that heated it, carry it forward. Share it with someone. Subscribe and stay close. The frontier had more people like Nora Callum than history took the time to record, and we find them when we can.